Kia ora, my name's Bob Williams. I've been involved in the evaluation field for 25 years, perhaps more, but I've also been involved in the various projects and programs that evaluators evaluate for many more years than that. I've also got quite a lot of experience in the application of ideas from the systems field, very trendy at the moment, to a variety of different circumstances, but especially in terms of evaluation. This particular book is a workbook, not a textbook, that actually goes into various ideas and methods and approaches of applying systemic ideas to evaluation design, although it's relevant to evaluation as a whole. What follows is a presentation that I gave to a conference that describes this particular book and some of its basic ideas. So for the next 20 minutes, sit back and listen to the presentation, and then I'll be back again afterwards to talk about how you can get hold of the book and various other aspects of the work that I do. Kia ora te whānau. Thanks very much for coming along to this conversation and this discussion and this presentation about the application of ideas from the systems field to the evaluation field. What we're going to do is I'm going to talk quite a bit about what I consider to be evaluation design. I'm then going to talk a little bit more about what I believe to be some of the core aspects of systems ideas as they can be applied to evaluation design. And then I'm going to go through three methods that actually highlight ways in which you can actually use systems ideas from the systems field to evaluation design. But before I do that, I want to highlight three things. The first one is that design we often think of as something that happens right at the beginning of a particular process, but in fact it occurs right through an entire process. It starts long before the evaluator comes on the scene, and it continues long after the evaluator has collected their paycheck and disappeared. In fact, even within the evaluation, we change things as they go. We change criteria, we could change methods, we change all sorts of things. We change the sampling frame, depending on kind of the results that we have. So those again are part of a design process that is continuous. The second thing I want to say is that there is nothing in this conversation about the selection of evaluation methods and methodologies. From my particular point of view, the selection of evaluation methods and methodologies are a product of an evaluation design. They are not part of the evaluation design. And the third thing that I want to say is a mental trick whilst you're listening to this. But actually it's a mental trick that is important in the application of systems ideas to the evaluation field. We usually refer to the client as the person who commissioned the evaluation. From a systems point of view, that's not a helpful way of thinking about things. It's too restrictive. So the mental trick that I play is that I imagine that the intervention is the client. And if you do that, you will find it much easier to apply systems ideas to evaluation design. So let's get started with the presentation, and we'll kick off with, well, what do I think are the main components of evaluation design? So here they are. The intervention purposes, plural. The scope and focus of the evaluation purposes, plural. What are or ought to be the consequences of the evaluation? As an aside, we spend a lot of time worrying about the consequences of the intervention we're evaluating, and although we talk about use of evaluation, we don't actually talk about the outcomes of evaluation, the consequences of the evaluation. The criteria that inform the critical area of judgments of merit, worth and significance that are the core of the evaluation task, as it were, and what questions will inform the collection of data so that judgments can be made. But what do we mean by a systems approach? Well, like the evaluation field, the systems field is so large that there are many different systems approaches. And to give you some idea, here's a diagram of the systems field produced by one of its major figures, Ray Eisen. And he points out that it's just his conceptualization of the systems field. Nevertheless, I find this diagram useful because the left-hand side of the diagram shows the wide range of intellectual traditions that the systems field draws from, and the right-hand side shows you how these are connected to the very wide range of systems approaches. And I'm showing you this because I want to be clear that there is no such thing as the systems approach. There are many systems approach. Mine is a systems approach that happens to draw on two specific areas of the systems field, namely soft systems and critical systems. So what's the framework that I use in systemic evaluation design? Some years ago, a group of systems and evaluation practitioners expressed what in their view underpinned those aspects of the many different systems approaches that were relevant to evaluation. We came up with three aspects: understanding interrelationships, engaging with perspectives, and reflecting on boundaries. And in common language, in terms of an intervention, what's the reality we are dealing with? How do people interpret that reality, given that there are many interpretations of even this particular talk? And then, what is or was, in terms of the intervention, the feasible and desirable thing to do? Or in terms of the evaluation, what are the feasible and desirable things to look at, given that we can't look at absolutely everything and we can't take every single particular perspective into consideration. But going back to the intervention is a kind of interrelationship of all these three particular aspects. So how does that relate to the core areas of systemic design or evaluation design? Well, here's my particular go at it. Different people will have different rules, but generally speaking, that's a guide that I use in terms of understanding how these three areas relate to the evaluation design features. So let's start with interrelationships. The most common way I use systems ideas around interrelationships is to do what most systems people do, and that's use diagrams. Generally speaking, of which there are hundreds of different particular diagramming approaches. So generally speaking, all of these particular diagrams are quite different from the kinds of diagrams that evaluators currently use or commonly use. The diagram I use will differ depending on what I want to know and the stage I'm at in terms of the evaluation process. So for instance, at the beginning of a particular evaluation, when I'm trying to find out what the potential scope and focus of an evaluation could be, exactly what the issues are involved, and invariably they're much more than the original commissioner thought. Who are the key stakeholders and what are the key stakes? I'll use rich picturing. Now, despite what it looks like, rich picturing isn't throwing spaghetti at a wall. It's not a brainstorm. It's an attempt to visualize the following aspects of the situation that I'm evaluating. And this particular situation is some issues around rice growing in sub-Saharan Africa. And one of the things that I'm particularly looking for are the things in blue. Now, once I have an idea about the focus of the evaluation, or maybe have collected some data, I may use an influence diagram. Now, influence diagrams are snapshots, just snapshots of what's influencing a particular moment in time. Like right now, what's influencing your receptiveness to the ideas I'm promoting right now. This helps me understand some of the core factors that actually might be worth exploring in an evaluation and hone in on some of those factors that seem to be critical. Just to give you some idea of the range of different ways that you can use these particular diagrams, the top one is really about improving company profits. And the lower one was some work that I did in Rwandan villages that were very concerned about the fact that the dislike that students had of school appeared to be associated with a 30% dropout in the first 2 years of primary school. Once I've done that, when I'm much closer to understanding what the important factors might be and a really clear idea of the causal dynamics between individual factors, I may use a causal diagram. Unlike influence diagrams, they illustrate specific, direct, causal relationships between components over a period of time, not in general terms what may or may not be influencing a situation at a particular moment of time. Now, there are many different ways of drawing causal relationships depending on what you want to do, the kinds of components, and how certain you are of the causal dynamics. And here are two that, for example, that are of exactly the same situation, basically getting drunk. One focuses on events and states, getting drunk, buying beer, annoying your partner. And the other one is of variables that are associated with those particular events or states. To be honest, I don't use them very often because you have to have a really clear idea of the causal dynamics between specific identified factors and the assumptions that underpin those relationships. Otherwise, you can draw really inaccurate conclusions. And to be honest, I have seen so many evaluations that have drawn very questionable conclusions using causal diagrams. So these diagrams help me with a wide range of design features, largely depending on which kind of diagram I use and where in the evaluation process I use them. Now, perspectives. Perspectives is all about the different ways an intervention can be understood. I want to stress in this particular illustration that it is not about different opinions about the same understanding, but different lenses through which the intervention can be viewed. So for instance, a needle exchange program where drug users can exchange dirty needles for clean ones can be evaluated from the perspective of health, reduction in HIV transmission, or safety, meeting places for drug users where they're not hassled, or even economics, the impact of house prices or rents in areas where drug users gather. The merit, value, significance of the program would be assessed differently through each of these particular lenses, and they would be assessed using different criteria. And that, to go back to what I said much earlier, is why I use the mental trick of the event of intervention being the client, since the commissioner of the evaluation will usually tend to have just one perspective on a program. So the evaluation may conclude that the program is successful through that lens, but actually, in reality, it's much more damaging when seen through other lenses, or perhaps even the other way around. Now, to assess this and discover the various perspectives or framings, I use a particular form of stakeholder analysis. Now, a stakeholder, here's my definition, is someone or something that is affected by or affects someone or something that is of interest to us. It's a bit of a mouthful, but I think you kind of get the idea. So what is and what constitutes my stakeholder analysis? Well, it's a simple box ticking and box filling exercise. So here's the beginning of it. Now, one thing I want you to notice is that I'm talking about stakeholder roles. And the reason I'm talking about stakeholder roles is look at that particular list. That relates to the rice production picture that you saw earlier on. These three roles, the village leader, the farmer, and the rice consumer, could actually be possessed by one person. A village leader could be a farmer and quite probably also is a rice consumer. How individual people juggle their roles has an enormous influence on how a particular program operates and how all the various different ways of framing and understanding a particular program start interacting. It's what makes programs complex. So once I've done that, and I've got a decent list, I ask the question, well, what is that role influenced by? And in this particular case, I've picked 3 just as an example. And then when I've done that, I ask, well, what does the role influence? And again, there are just 3 examples of that, 3 or 4 examples. And what that helps me identify is the motivation or interest, what actually makes people want to participate in this particular intervention. What makes it worthwhile for them? And from that, I can do lots of things. I can understand the scope and the focus and all sorts of things in terms of the intervention. But most critically, it actually helps me develop the criteria, appropriate criteria. Now, many of those criteria may have nothing to do with the kinds of criteria that the commissioners of a particular evaluation stipulated in their terms of reference. But this is actually the criteria that people who are involved in the program are actually using. And it's our responsibility to understand that and to judge the merit, value, and worth of the program from their perspective. So, engaging with multiple perspectives does lots of things. This is just an example in terms of what, in particular, I find exploring multiple perspectives help me with. So, finally, let me spend some time on boundaries. It's a common misperception that the systemic approaches are about including everything. But in fact, the reverse is true. Systemic approaches are about being smart, deliberative, and well-informed about what to exclude. Everything we do is bounded in some way. Every intervention, every evaluation. It's impossible to draw and view and understand every single interrelationship at every available scale. It's impossible to accommodate every single perspective, as I said earlier. So to be able to do anything, like introduce and manage an intervention, we have to draw boundaries. Boundaries of space, time, purpose, control, knowledge, values, perspectives, and many, many other things. How an intervention draws its boundaries and where it draws its boundaries will hugely affect its merit, value, and significance. Thus, delivering on boundary decisions within intervention is a critical part of an evaluation. And for this aspect of an evaluation design, I use a framework taken from Critical Systems. It identifies 4 important boundary decisions that are taken by any intervention and poses a series of questions about those decisions. The specific questions will obviously vary depending on the intervention, so take what follows as a bit of a guide. So in terms of purpose, what were the appropriate decisions made about the purpose of the intervention, who benefited from those purposes, and how were the benefits identified? In terms of control, were the appropriate decisions made about who managed the delivery of those purposes? Who had the power of veto over the intervention? Who actually controlled the intervention rather than managed it? And was the decision that was made over the boundary between management and control, to what effect did it affect the delivery of those particular benefits? Next comes knowledge. The successful management and control of an intervention requires information, and it's impossible to use all the information available or indeed all the relevant knowledge systems available. Just think about the debates around so-called Western knowledge systems and indigenous knowledge systems. So was the boundary between the knowledge used and the knowledge ignored or marginalized appropriate? And finally, was this the right thing to do? How well the intervention managed the boundary between those who benefited and those who did not are absolutely critical, especially when it comes to issues around sustainability. But wait, there's more. The evaluation itself is an intervention. So therefore, it too has to draw boundaries. And one of the most critical boundaries that it draws are the criteria. Because it decides what's worthwhile and what's not. It decides what's in an acceptable significance and what's not. So you need to ask the questions, do the criteria specifically relate to the purpose and beneficiaries? Who decides the criteria? Were they the right people to do so? Do you have the appropriate knowledge to assess the criterion? And what does the criteria marginalize, and who is potentially harmed by that? So this is the whole shebang. Now, I'm often asked, how can you start applying these ideas? And here's my advice. Start with an aspect that interests you, use it in a safe place with interested stakeholders, seek medium or low risk, medium reward first, use it when it would add something useful, be aware that this could change your relationship with key stakeholders. This is going back to the whole idea of the intervention as the client. Don't be purist, adapt, invent, play around with the ideas, but overall have a lot of fun. And if you want to know a bit more, here are some references to work that I've done. So let's just look at some of these in a bit more detail. The bottom left is Systems, Concepts and Action, which is a collection of 20 or so methods and methodologies from right across the systems field and how they can be applied and where they can be applied. In the bottom right, Wicked Solutions is a sort of compilation of some of those methods into a particular process that can actually be used to address and resolve fairly complex problems. Both of them are available in hard copy versions, and Wicked Solutions is also available as a PDF download at the reference that's already there. Immediately above Wicked Solutions is Systems Diagramming. That's a book in process at the moment, and I'm posting draft chapters to my website so that people can look at them and comment on them. Basically, it's looking at a number of the diagramming methods which are very common in the systems field. In terms of this particular presentation, systemic evaluation design clearly is the main basis of this particular presentation. The actual book itself is available as a PDF download from above there. It is donationware, in other words, you can pay me if you want. And it goes into a lot more specific detail around the various topics that this particular presentation arranged. But it is a workbook, not a textbook. So expect to do some work and bring some work to it. So I hope you found the presentation useful, and I look forward to hearing from you via my website. If you have any kinds of questions or any comments, and good luck with applying systemic ideas to your work. You'll find it worthwhile. Ka kite anō.